Hi, this is Grant with Fight for Forensics, and today we're going to be talking about flowing, which is note-taking in debate. So we've got a pretty simple program for today. First, we're going to learn how to flow, and second, we're going to learn how to make a printable pre-flow, or a flow that you make ahead of time so you don't have to flow, when your judge is waiting for you to start the round. So if you already know how to flow and how to make a good pre-flow, you probably don't need to watch this video. The only thing I might suggest is watching how to make a printable pre-flow if you've never done that before, because I found that's pretty helpful, especially for first and second year debaters. So to begin, what is flowing? Flowing is, just simply put, a special way that debaters take notes. So when a lot of novices get into their first few rounds, they'll try to take notes like they might if they were in, say, a lecture or something like that. However, this won't work out very well for you. Because first, there's just too much information being said in a speech at too fast of a rate of delivery, and second, it can be really hard to have your rebuttals organized if you're taking notes in that form. So instead, we've got flowing, which is our special way that we take notes. The easiest way to learn how to flow, I think, is just to walk through an example. So we'll do that together. So how to flow is you just get one sheet of paper for each case. So you're going to have 2 sheets of paper total during a round, one for the affirmative case and one for the negative case. For the affirmative case, you divide that sheet of paper into 5 different columns, one for each different speech that case is going to be talked about. Similarly, in the negative case, you use 4 columns, as the negative case is only talked about in 4 different speeches. Some people prefer to flow using one sheet of paper by dividing it in half like you can see there. However, I wouldn't recommend this because you're probably going to run out of room. And if you're not running out of room, then you're either not writing down enough information or your opponent isn't giving very much information in the first place. So to begin, we've got our piece of paper divided into 5 columns. Now just to clarify here, although this sheet of paper is horizontal, that's just because that's the landscape of your screen right now. I would suggest using a portrait landscape for flowing because you're going to run out of room going up and down more than you are going left to right. So how flowing works is in each respective column, you just write down what it is that they said in their speech in that order. So let's say that the affirmative in this speech was giving a constructive on the resolution resolved. Just governments ought to ensure that employers pay a living wage. Now, we're just going to walk through how we would take notes for a hypothetical constructive that was given. Now, the cases that you'll see that we're taking notes for here are just really, really simple cases with totally made up things. That way we can just make everything simple and learn the structure of flowing, so don't worry so much about the actual content of what's being flowed. So let's say that the affirmative valued justice. And their justification was that the resolution asks, what a just government has to do, so you have to look to the value of justice. Now, the important thing with flowing is that you're writing down both what it is that they're claiming, that is, that there's a value of justice, and you also write down the justification for it, and that's that the resolution asks specifically a question of a just government. Next, let's say the affirmative had a value criterion of helping the least advantaged, and they used some sort of expert opinion from a guy named Johnson saying it's arbitrary for some people to be born without good opportunities, so justice requires helping the least advantaged. Now, the important thing to notice here is whenever somebody uses evidence, being that an empirical fact like some sort of study or statistic, or even just some sort of expert opinion on the issue or some sort of argument, that anything that's cited, you're always going to want to note that somewhere on your paper. Now, the best way that I found to do that is just to write down the author's name and underline it, because that tells us that when we're looking at this specific set of arguments, we're talking about the things that were directly cited from another person. So once again, value justice, criterion helping the least advantaged. And let's say they just ran one contention, and that being that a living wage helps the least advantaged, because those without skills are those who are going to work the minimum wage in the first place, and people who are working the minimum wage don't make a lot of money, which means they're in poor living conditions. And let's say then that they had a piece of evidence from Forbes which said that a living wage would increase pay and living conditions, thus it would help the least advantaged. So as you can see, what we've done is we functionally created an outline of that affirmative case in that one specific column. Now, the reason that we flow in these specific columns is that's going to make it really helpful when we get to our rebuttals. So that's what our flow is going to look like at the end of the affirmative constructive. But to clarify, right now we still have 2 sheets of paper, and the negative constructive should be blank as the negative hasn't said anything yet. So let's go now to what's going to happen during the negative constructive and the first negative rebuttal, that is that first 7-minute negative speech. So the first thing the negative is going to do is give their case. So let's say that the negative also values justice. And maybe we don't need to write down the justification for this because it's the exact same value as the affirmatives, so they agree. Let's say instead that the negative has a value criterion of protecting autonomy. And their argument is that the government is composed of people, they're not like superior to us, it's just other people, so the government can't violate our autonomy. Once again, a pretty simple argument, but once again, don't look at the content. We're just talking about how to flow here. So let's say that the negative's contention was that a living wage violates autonomy because people have the freedom to make their own trades. And if I want to wash tables for you for 3 pancakes per hour, then I have that right. And for the government to restrict that, that is to have any sort of a wage standard in there, is to violate our autonomy. So this is what your flow is going to look like after the negative gives their constructive. Now obviously though, the negative speech doesn't end there. They also respond to the affirmative's case. So let's look at how we're going to flow that. So what we would do then is we'd take our other sheet of paper out and we just record the negative's arguments as they give them. So let's say the negative accepts the value of justice because that's their own value. So let's say that the negative accepts the value of justice because that's their own value. But obviously they're going to want to disagree with the criterion. So let's say that the first argument that the negative debater makes is, oh yeah, helping the least advantaged is good, but not when it violates autonomy because autonomy is the most important thing. And let's also say that the negative argues that people are only entitled to their natural rights, not other people's property, so wealth is irrelevant to questions of what a just government has to do. And lastly, let's say they responded to the first contention by saying, oh, whoa, actually, a living wage causes unemployment. And they use this sort of Smith analysis here saying, oh, I've got 100 studies that show that increasing the minimum wage causes unemployment, and the least skilled lose their jobs first, and it's better to have a bad job than no job, so a living wage actually hurts the least advantage. So this is what our flow is going to look like after the end of that first 7-minute negative speech. Now obviously in an actual round there'd be a lot more content going on because the cases wouldn't be so short or simple, but what's important to realize is the structure of how these arguments were responded to. As you can see, each response lines up with the argument that's right next to it. So the good thing about having this column system is the arguments flow from left to right. So the value of justice, the response, is directly in the next column to the right. Same with the value criterion of the least advantage. Now, some people actually like to draw the arrows just so they can see better where the arguments are organized. You can do that, doesn't really matter. Either way though, the important thing to see is that the reason that flowing really helps with your organization is it lets you realize how different arguments are interacting with one another so you can make good choices when it's coming to your rebuttals and so you don't forget to respond to certain arguments. So although this is all we have right now, obviously the affirmative is going to want to respond to the rebuttals made against it, so the arguments would just follow, keep going from left to right with responses. So at the end of this speech, our flow is going to look like this. We've got one sheet for the affirmative case that has the responses made by the negative, and then our sheet for the negative only has the negative constructive because obviously the affirmative hasn't spoken yet. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about is preflowing, which is just flowing your own case before the round. Now you need to have your own case flowed so that you don't perhaps mishandle your own arguments or forget to extend a certain argument in a certain way. Just it's good to make sure that you've got as good of organization for your own case on your flow as you do for your opponents. Now this is something that you're going to want to do before the round. The reasons you want to do this before the round is if you do it during prep time, maybe you'll have less time to come up with new responses to your opponent, or maybe if you do it right before the round starts, your judge and your opponent will kind of be annoyed they're being forced to wait for you. Either way, it's just always safer to have this done before the round. Now, although a lot of people flow on paper, and this is totally fine, I think it's also valuable to flow digitally. So in terms of how to creating a digital preflow is actually really easy, and it's something that I would recommend. So let's talk about how we can do this. So as you can see, we've got Microsoft Word here. Now, in order to create a preflow, all you need to do is create a table. So you're going to create a table with one row in either 4 or 5 columns based on whether it's an affirmative case or a negative case. So let's say we're preflowing our negative case, so we only want 4 columns. So you've created your table, but as you can see, it's obviously pretty small. Now, what you're going to want to do is you just want to stretch the table as wide as the page will let you. Now, in order to let you make this preflow even bigger and to fit more information in, you can actually adjust the margins on your page. So if you reduce the margins, you can actually increase the amount of space you have on the paper within those boxes to write. And one thing to note is that if you create your margins too small, your printer may have certain issues printing it. Now, as you can see, Microsoft Word gave me this warning right now. And how small of margins you can actually create is based on what type of printer you have, so you might want to figure that out ahead of time. The best way to figure that out is just to try printing smaller margins and see if it can handle it. So what we're going to do is, once again, we've got our smaller margins here. You can obviously fine-tune that yourself. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to your borders and shading, and you're going to want to take off the borders that you don't need. So you don't want borders on the top or the bottom because those might limit your space to write. And similarly, you may not want borders on the left or right. But for the most part, this is an aesthetic choice. So what you can see here is that we've got our 4 columns for our 4 different speeches. So then you just type in the outline for your case, and it's pretty simple from there. So we're going to jump forward and look to an example that I've already created a preflow for. So you should be able to see here that preflowing is actually pretty easy. The important thing is that you outline your own argument and you outline it in a way that makes sense to you. So when you're looking at my preflow, you might not understand what exactly it is that my argument says, but that doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, flowing and preflowing is about understanding your own arguments so that you don't make mistakes with them in rebuttals. The benefits of digitally preflowing are, first, you've kind of already got pre-written extensions. In other words, you know the essential parts of your arguments and you know how each thing functions logically. You know what you have to extend, which arguments you have to win in order to win the round. Second, preflowing digitally is really helpful because it saves a lot of time. You don't have to preflow your case before each round. You can just print off a stack of them before you go to a tournament, and that makes everything a lot smoother. And third, because you don't have your own handwriting there, it might be easier to read. I know that as a left-handed male, my handwriting was atrocious. So lastly, let's just talk about some extra stuff. First, practice is always good. A lot of people, even when they know how to flow, they still struggle to get down all the information that they have to. And the best suggestion here is just practice more. Good ways to do this are just watching rounds online, just generally getting experience at tournaments, practice rounds with your own teammates, or just really writing down anything quickly can be very helpful with practicing. One thing that I know some people had success with is actually just trying to write down and flow different rap songs or things like that, just because the point is you're teaching your hand how to write faster. Next, make sure that you're learning how to summarize different arguments in different ways. For example, you might want to create a symbol for value criterion instead of writing value criterion, or you might want to make your own abbreviations, which means that you should always be developing your own system of shorthand. Remember that what matters isn't that somebody else could look at your flow and understand what's actually being said. What's important is that you understand what's being said. And shorthand can be very helpful because you can just use whatever random symbols you want and you're the only one that has to understand them. And lastly, I wouldn't suggest flowing on a laptop. Now, while some people like to do this, I personally wouldn't recommend it. First, if you're flowing on a laptop, it can make a lot of noise when you're hitting the keys, and that might be distracting to either your opponent or your judge, and depending on how traditional of an area you debate in, that might be seen as a bad thing. Second, you can't really create symbols on the fly like you can if you're writing with your hand, so that can make it a little bit harder if you mess up to fix that mistake. And third, if you're flowing on your laptop, it might be difficult to both look at your flow as well as look at evidence you may have prepared ahead of time or different responses you've already pre-written or even your own case. These are things that it's helpful to have both in front of you at the same time. So I would suggest that if you have a laptop, you should save it for pulling up old evidence or that type of thing rather than flowing. So this has been Grant with Fight for Forensics, and I hope now that you've got a decent understanding of how to flow. Thank you and see you next time.